Hey guys, Mr. Cannon. Today we have a video about theory of the firm. We're going to cover short run costs. The good news is if you felt comfortable at the end of last class with short run production, then this is very similar. It's going to be basically everything in opposite, but it covers a lot of the same ground. Remember that when we're talking about theory of the firm, the idea is that we're trying to figure out what motivates firms to do to make decisions. And so what we're looking at is what they would be looking at in terms of how much things cost, how much they're able to produce, and what benefit they can get. What you're going to do is you're going to get a blank sheet of paper that you'll be turning in before you leave today. And the questions will be embedded in the video. There should be 4 total questions, 2 charts and 2 graphs, and they will be embedded after the actual bit. What I would do is have your notebooks out, and if you have something in the video that you did not cover in your notes already, then you can get that down, and then you'll just pause during the parts that require the assignment. And that'll be called short run costs, practice number 1. Okay, so first thing I wanted to bring up the difference between implicit and explicit costs and the definition of economic costs. These are just kind of terminologies that we're going to be using. They're not really required for the assignment today, but you do need to make sure you have them in your notes. So explicit costs are anything that a firm does not own and they actually have to go out and spend money on. Okay, so if you don't own your building, you have to pay rent. If you don't own, if you're having to pay electricity and things like that, right? These are things that you as an individual or you as a firm would not necessarily own. Implicit costs are more implied costs, obviously by the word. Basically, it's the opportunity cost of not using things that are yours for something else, okay? So for example, in this example, this true but helpful example, so my friend left his longtime girlfriend of 2.5 years. She wanted to leave her job and take up acting. So let's turn tragedy into learning. So let's look at the explicit and implicit costs of that decision if she were a firm, because she as herself is an entrepreneur. So we'll look at how that plays out, okay? So explicit costs would be costs that this person has to pay for because they do not themselves own the capacity to do those, okay, or cover those. So first one would be acting classes. You cannot give yourself acting classes. So that is an explicit cost, something that will need to be paid out, right? I'm just making these numbers up, obviously. Second would be headshot photos. If you do not have your own photo studio, you cannot do that for yourself. So that is an explicit cost. You are having to take money and physically give it to someone else, right? Agent fees, I just made up a number. And again, you cannot be your own agent. So physically taking money out of your pocket and paying an explicit amount of money to another person or firm, right? And we can tally that up as $7,500, let's say, of explicit costs, okay? So if you're her, then these are your explicit costs. If you are McDonald's, it's paying for all of the food, it's paying for all of the labor, it's paying to keep the lights on. McDonald's does not own its own, energy plant. And so these are costs that they physically have to take a bill out and say, or take a check out and pay a bill to someone else explicitly with that number, okay? Implicit costs would be the implied costs, the opportunity cost of using your talent and your skills or things that you own to make a choice or make a decision, right? So a good example from the book is if you decide to start working out of let's say you have a second bedroom in your house and you decide to start your own business in your house. It does not cost you any money to run an office out of a second bedroom, but you could be paid rent for that room. And your implicit cost would be the money that you're losing by not renting that room out, okay? In this example, the opportunity cost would be a salary leftover. So like if you are leaving a job that pays, let's say 60 grand a year, you are not having to pay 60 grand, but the implied cost of that decision would be 60 grand, okay? And then let's say you were taking your weekends or your nights or something like that to work on your craft or whatever, you would not have to pay for money lost because you're not working at night or on the weekends. But it is implied that you are losing that in opportunity cost, okay? Again, if you're a firm and you are, let's say you're starting your own business out of your office or making your second bedroom your office, your implicit costs might be the rent lost from using that room as an office and the time that you could have spent on the weekends making money in something else, but you're spending it on your business. So it's implied that you're kind of losing that opportunity. Again, it doesn't mean that this is the worst idea. It just means that, remember, economics is all about choice. And so it's being aware of the implied costs of the opportunities you're giving up, right? So if we're looking at this situation, what we can take is we can take our explicit costs, the things we physically have to write a check for, the implicit costs, the things that we are giving up to make that decision, and the total economic cost is all of that put together, okay? Now, again, that doesn't mean that in this scenario, it doesn't mean that you're paying 78 grand a year. It means that your total costs of that decision, whether explicit when you pay for something or implicit when you lose the opportunity for something, that is your economic cost, how much a decision actually costs. Now, we have a couple types of costs here. We have fixed and variable costs that firms undergo, okay? Now, fixed costs do not change based on what quantity firms produce, okay? So let's say, I keep going back to the pizza shop, but let's say I have one cash register, okay? And I have to pay $100 a month to keep that thing connected to the network, okay? If I make a ton of sales today, it costs me $100 a month. If I sell no pizzas tomorrow, it costs me $100 a month, okay? That is a fixed cost that does not change based on how many pizzas I make. It just doesn't, okay? If I have, let's say if I pay a cleaning crew to come in and clean the restaurant at night, and I have to pay, $200 a week. If I sell a ton of pizzas this week, it's $200. If I sell no pizzas this week, it's $200. And I take all of those costs that I expect to be the same regardless of how much I produce, I put them together, and that is my fixed cost. It is fixed because it does not move. That is what you expect to pay, right? This would be, how much rent do you pay on your building? Doesn't change based on how many pizzas I make, right? Now, variable cost does. So these are costs that do change when I have a higher quantity. So if I'm making more pizzas and I need more cooks on staff, I'm going to have to pay more in labor. If I have a slower week and I tell some cooks to go home, I will pay less in my labor, my variable costs, right? So based on how much I actually make, the quantity that I produce, my variable costs can go up or down. Now, when I add those together, I get my total cost, okay? So I get my fixed costs, like my cleaning fees, my rent, my maintenance fees, and then I add my variable costs, right? So my fixed cost is just constant. My variable cost rises and falls based on how much I produce, what quantity of my good I produce, and I put those together and I get my total cost, which will fluctuate along with my variable. Now, just like production rather, I can also find my marginal cost. And remember, when we think marginal, it's like if we have one more, what would it cost, or what would we be producing? Okay, so I'll show you the example in a second, but our basic formula is going to be change in total cost over change in output. So if I raise my cost by $5 and I change my output by 1, my marginal cost would be 5 because my cost has gone up by 5, my output has gone up by 1, so that 1 costs me a margin of $5, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to get this chart down in your notes. We will be filling this out kind of together to give you an idea, and this will be like your example. So over here we have our output of 0 to 6. So this would be our total output if you wanted to consider it this in terms of production. This is how much we're making. So 1 pizza, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And I've provided our variable cost, okay? So our variable cost is going to be $0, 10, 17, and you see it changes, right? Based on how many we're making, again, because it's variable. So if I'm paying a higher staff, if I'm having to pay for more dough because I'm making more pizzas, this cost changes. Now, if I were to think, what would my fixed cost be down the line? Think about what a fixed cost means. Take a second, think about what do you think that fixed cost is going to look like down the line? Correct. Maybe, I don't know. You might have been wrong, but I hope you weren't. Fixed cost does not change. So regardless of how many pizzas I'm selling an hour, 0 or 6, my fixed cost does not change, right? So if I'm looking at a fixed cost of $10, let's say an hour, to pay for maintenance or cleaning or rent or things like that, that fixed cost won't change. Now, total cost, we can figure that out as well. Total cost is my variable cost plus my fixed cost. So hopefully we can figure this out, right? If I'm making 0 pieces an hour, my variable cost is 0, so I'm not having to pay for dough or more laborers or anything like that. My fixed cost is 10 for cleaning, maintenance, and rent, and my total cost would be 10. If I start making 1 per hour, my variable cost rises, my fixed cost stays the same, total cost 20. And you can see how that goes down there, right? So all you're doing is you're adding your variable, which changes based on how much you're producing, and your fixed, which stays the same based on how much you're producing. Now, marginal cost, Bells ringing. Now, marginal cost works just like production. So we are trying to figure out if I go from producing 0 to 1. Last class, we were trying to figure out how much the production cost. Here, the production was worth. Here, we're trying to figure out how much that charges us. How much money is that going to cost us as a firm? So if I go from producing 0 to 1, the question is, how much will that extra production cost? And what you're looking at is the change in total cost over the change in output. So here we have a change in total cost of 10, a change in output of 1. Format changed for some reason. That was my fault. I forgot about that. We have a change in cost of 10, a change in output of 1. That's 10 over 1. That gives us a marginal cost of 10. So the cost for us going from 0 to 1 is going to be 10. Now, as we move on, the marginal cost will fluctuate, just like our marginal production from earlier. If I were trying to figure out what is the cost of going from 1 pizza to 2, my old cost is 20. My new my new total cost is 27. So my change in total cost would be 7. And then my change in total output would be 1, meaning the cost of going from 1 to 2 is going to be 7. As we continue, 27 to 35 has a change of 8 over 1, 8. Now, this seems pretty straightforward. In future, you might not have jumps of 1. You'll have jumps of 3 plus and all that. So just be aware that this would be the formula, your change in total cost over change in output. And that tells you how much one more, when you think marginal, think one more, how much one more pizza in this instance would cost. Now, here's question 1 of today's assignment. You have a list of variable input, which in this case would be labor. Hint, you don't need that right now, but you will need it for the next question. So put it down, but don't worry about it for the math right now. You have your total product, so the amount, or which total output in this case, but it's the same, total product, the amount that we're putting out, and then total fixed costs. And I have given you your total variable cost. So this is the same thing as variable cost here. It is just total variable cost for this good. So what I want you to figure out in this assignment, which you'll be turning in again today, is the fixed cost for this good. Using that, the total cost for this good, which you'll use by adding these together, and then the marginal cost for each one of these steps. So when I go from producing 0 to 2 to 5 to 9, what is the marginal cost of that production? Okay, and we'll come back when you're done with that. So go ahead and pause the video because the next section is new. Okay, so the next section has to do with average costs. Hopefully this, if the last section felt pretty good and you asked me questions in class, because you should be watching this in class, this should be pretty straightforward as well. So I'm not necessarily looking for how much fixed costs I'm required to pay in total. I might be looking at how much of my fixed cost is going to each individual product I'm making. So if my fixed cost is $200 and I'm making 1 pizza an hour, my fixed cost, or my average fixed cost, the average cost of my fixed cost that's going per product would be 200. But if I have 200 pizzas going out an hour and my average fixed cost, or my total fixed cost is 200, my average would be 200 over 200. So only $1 of every fixed cost is getting charged into a pizza, okay? In other words, we're taking our total fixed, variable, and total and general cost and dividing it by the quantity that we are actually producing at that point, okay? So for example, like I said, if our total fixed cost is 200 and we're only selling 4 pizzas, that means our average fixed cost is 50, right? So that's pretty high. But firms can make decisions if they have an average fixed cost that's high, but they're producing a lot, then this would be significantly lower, okay? And this is going to be important for firms that make things that cost a lot of money to make, but they make so much of it that it actually, their average fixed cost might be pretty low. A good example would be oil and gas. You know, the total fixed cost of an oil rig, of staff, of just everything that goes into drilling, especially offshore, wherever, that is a huge undertaking. But the quantity of the millions and millions and millions of gallons of oil that get produced, their average fixed cost might actually be fairly low. So you might say that costs a lot of money to make, but if they're producing such a high quantity at such a high value, their average fixed cost might be pretty reasonable, which is how, oil companies make money, but McDonald's can also make money making burgers, right? their total fixed cost might be really low. I mean, why do you think companies who sell really cheap goods really want a low minimum wage? Because if their total fixed cost, I'm sorry, it'd be variable for this part because it'd be labor, their total variable cost could be really low. So they don't really have to sell as high a quantity, and their average variable cost might be fine. Okay. So these are our three formulas. Now, if we're looking at how that would look for this example, again, I would recommend you would put this in your notes for an example, but you don't necessarily need to. You'll just need to do it in a second on an assignment. You can see how this would work out. So if we're doing here, let's do average variable cost first. So I'm going to do right here. So my average variable cost is total variable, which is 17, divided by quantity, which would be 2. So if I take that, 17 divided by 2, it gives me an average variable cost of $8.50. And that tells me that my variable costs, labor, like dough or sauce or whatever I'm using to make it, that divided by 2 pizzas, each pizza is costing me $8.50 in variable costs, okay? Whereas my fixed costs, down here, my fixed costs cost me 10, regardless of how many pizzas I make. So 10 divided by 2, that's $5 of fixed cost per pizza, okay? Now, if I was looking at total cost, I could do the same thing. Average total cost 27. I'm sorry, my total cost 27. My average, I would just divide that by quantity. 27 divided by 2 gets me 13.50. Okay. Now, this is one of those things that might be helpful to understand when you're going to like a restaurant and you think, man, I can make, Olive Garden's a great example. You're like, I can make pasta with cream sauce for about $3, probably less. Why are they going to charge me $13? Well, you're not paying for the out of the jar sauce they use or whatever it is, right? You're paying for the lights, the labor, the manager's salary, the cleaning staff at home at night. You're paying for everything, their insurance, their all this other stuff, right? Shipping, and then on top of that, $3 for the pasta. And so you go, why does that cost me so much? Well, they have these fixed costs here. They have variable costs, and then they look at their total cost divided by quantity. And you'll see that, if I'm only making 6 pizzas, $20 a pizza is what it costs me. What do you think I'm going to charge you, right? So that's just an example of this. Now, here we have number 2. I'm going to pause it in a second. This is the second half of your graphing of your table assignment. So you're going to use the same data that you used on the first question to complete these final 3 columns. Average variable cost, average fixed cost, and average total cost. I recommend you keep this up and pause because I have the formulas here. Once you complete those, go ahead and move on to the next slide. And if you are done with that, here is these are the final 2 questions. I'm not going to get a ton into graphing. I just want you to kind of jump into it because a lot of us felt, I think, very comfortable with short run production graphing, and it's essentially identical to that. So what I'm going to ask you to do is for question 3, I'm going to ask you to compose a graph that covers marginal cost, so the cost of every additional quantity produced, and the average variable cost. It's going to look something like this. And we're going to have output on the bottom for this one, and we are going to have costs on the left. So that will be the difference between this graph and the production graph. You'll notice on the production graph, I have one up here, we have variable input on the bottom, so labor, units of variable input is what we've been covering. But here, we are actually looking at output. So what are we producing? What are we actually making based on cost? So production, we have variable input and output. Here we have output and costs. And what you'll notice, obviously you're going to plot it out using the numbers of the questions earlier, but what you'll notice is that this is going to be really identical to the production graphs. So that whole law of diminishing returns shows up here. We'll talk more about that later, but I mean, you can see when we're looking at marginal product, there's a point where adding more pieces of labor really costs us money and really kind of makes us less productive. Well, there's a point here where the marginal cost of something, so there's a sweet spot where making more actually is cheaper, and then toward the end, making more costs way, way more. So you'll notice that as you graph it, but that is normal. And then question 4, you're going to graph your averages, your average variable cost, your average fixed cost, and your average total cost. And that again will be on the axis of output and costs. It will not be on input and output. Okay, we'll deal way more with the comparisons between the two, but for right now, I just want those two graphs. So at the end of this, that should be it. At the end of this, you should have question 1, which is the first set of tables, question 2, which is the second set of tables, question 3, which is your MC-AVC graph, and question 4, which is your averages graph. Good luck. I am hopefully in class with you at the moment, so just ask me if you have questions. Thank you, guys.